She stood on the porch, a foreclosure notice in her trembling hand, watching the banker's carriage roll away. Her family's legacy was gone. But when a nameless cowboy rode into town, threw $4,000 onto the bank counter, and walked away without asking for a single thing, the real mystery began. The wind sweeping across the Wyoming plains carried the bitter scent of dry sage and impending ruin. It was the summer of 1887 a year that the territory would remember for its merciless heat, which had arrived like a vulture immediately following the deadliest winter in recorded history. The locals called it the Big Die-Up. The blizzards had buried the cattle standing where they froze, and when the spring thaw finally came, it revealed the devastating financial ruin of nearly every independent rancher outside of Cheyenne. Clara Montgomery stood on the decaying front porch of the Broken Oak Ranch, a property her family had bled into the soil to build. Her calloused hands, roughened by months of performing the labor of 3 men, gripped the wooden railing until her knuckles turned white. At 24, Clara possessed a fierce, hardened beauty. Her sun-kissed skin and sharp, intelligent eyes spoke of a woman who had traded her youth for the survival of her family's land. But survival was a fragile thing when you owed your soul to the Wyoming Territorial Bank. Her father, Thomas Montgomery, had been a proud man, a pioneer who believed that hard work could conquer any landscape. But pride couldn't melt 6 feet of solid ice, and it couldn't revive 2,000 head of frozen Hereford cattle. Desperate to keep the ranch afloat and buy feed at exorbitant prices, Thomas had taken out a massive loan against the deed. He had signed the papers in the lavish, mahogany-paneled office of Josiah Sterling, a banker whose tailored silk suits and oiled mustache hid the predatory instincts of a rattlesnake. Thomas hadn't survived to see the consequences of his gamble. 2 months ago, a horse had spooked during a routine muster, throwing him to the rocky ground. He never woke up. He had been buried on the ridge overlooking the valley, taking his dreams and the ranch's protection to the grave with him. Clara had spent the week since her father's death trying to negotiate with Sterling. She had sold her mother's antique silver tea set, her father's prized repeating rifle, and even her own wedding dowry just to make the interest payments. But Josiah Sterling wasn't interested in interest. He wanted the broken oak. The rumble of wooden wheels on hard-packed dirt pulled Clara from her thoughts. A black buggy, polished to a mirror shine that seemed offensive in the dusty landscape, was pulling into her yard. 2 men sat in the front. One was Sheriff Miller, a man who looked distinctly uncomfortable with his current errand. The other was Josiah Sterling. Clara stepped off the porch, wiping her dusty hands on her denim apron. She stood her ground in the center of the yard, refusing to meet them at the carriage like a subservient host. Sheriff Miller climbed down first, pulling his wide-brimmed hat from his head. He was a good man, but he was bound by the badge pinned to his chest. "Afternoon, Clara," he said, his voice thick with regret. "I wish to God I was riding out here just to check on you. But you know why we're here." Sterling stepped down with agonizing slowness, carefully dusting a speck of imaginary dirt from his lapel. He offered Clara a smile that didn't reach his cold, calculating eyes. "Miss Montgomery, it grieves me to see you struggling so. I told your late father that this land was too much for one man, let alone one young, unmarried woman. The land is fine, Mr. Sterling," Clara said, her voice steady despite the hammer beating in her chest. "It's the bank's terms that are the problem. I brought you $300 last week. That covers the month. It covers the penalty for the late payment from the month prior. My dear, Sterling corrected, pulling a folded legal document from his breast pocket. The principal was due in full upon the death of the primary signatory. It's a standard clause. You owe $4,852.16. A sum, I am quite certain, you cannot produce. You know there isn't a rancher in this territory with that kind of cash right now. Clara fired back, stepping closer. You're purposely bleeding us dry, and I know why. Sterling raised an eyebrow, feigning innocence. Oh, don't play the fool with me. Josiah, a surveyor from the Union Pacific, was in town last month. He was asking questions about the grade of the valley behind my ridge. You know the railroad is looking for a new spur line, and Broken Oak is sitting right in their path. You don't want my ranch for the cattle. You want it because the railroad will pay you 10 times what it's worth to lay their tracks across it. Sterling's smile vanished, replaced by a cold, hard line. The polite veneer shattered. You are an observant woman, Miss Montgomery, but being observant does not pay your debts. He shoved the paper toward the sheriff. Sheriff Miller sighed heavily and handed the document to Clara. It's the final notice of foreclosure. Clara, I'm sorry. The property is to be seized and sold at public auction tomorrow at noon on the courthouse steps. If you don't vacate the premises by sundown tomorrow, I'll have to remove you by force. Clara took the paper. It felt heavier than lead. The legal jargon blurred together, but the red seal at the bottom was perfectly clear. It was the end. Have your bags packed. Miss Montgomery, Sterling said smoothly, climbing back into his carriage. It's a harsh world out there. Perhaps you can find work in a saloon in town. I hear they are always looking for pretty girls to sweep the floors. Clara stood in the dust, watching the carriage turn around and head back toward Cheyenne. She didn't cry. Tears were a waste of water in Wyoming. Instead, she looked up at the ridge where her father was buried, a silent promise forming in her heart. She didn't know how, but she was not going to let Josiah Sterling steal her home. The midday sun beat down on the town square of Cheyenne like a blacksmith's hammer. The courthouse steps were crowded, drawing a morbidly curious audience. In the west, a foreclosure auction was a grim form of entertainment, a stark reminder to every man present of how close they all lived to the edge of ruin. Clara stood at the base of the wooden steps, her posture rigid, dressed in her best black morning gown. She refused to hide in the shadows. If Josiah Sterling was going to steal her home, she was going to make him look her in the eye while he did it. At the top of the steps stood Arthur Higgins, the town clerk and acting auctioneer. He wiped sweat from his brow with a checkered handkerchief, looking nervously between Clara and Josiah Sterling. Sterling stood confidently off to the side, smoking a slim cigar, flanked by 2 rough-looking men he had hired for protection. "Ladies and gentlemen," Higgins announced, his voice carrying over the murmuring crowd. "We are gathered today by order of the Territorial Court to auction the deed, title, and all standing fixtures of the property known as the Broken Oak Ranch, to satisfy the outstanding debts of the late Thomas Montgomery." A heavy silence fell over the square. The few ranchers in the crowd looked down at their boots, out of respect for Clara. No local man would bid against her. It was an unspoken code. Everyone knew this auction was a formality. Sterling was the only one with the capital to buy the land. The bank's lien stands at $4,852.16. Higgins read from his ledger. "Do I have an opening bid?" $500, Sterling called out lazily, taking a drag from his cigar. A murmur of disgust rippled through the crowd. He was trying to take a 3,000-acre ranch for pennies. I have 500, Higgins stammered. Do I have 6? Silence. The sound of a horse whinnying down the street echoed loudly. Clara closed her eyes. The physical pain in her chest was overwhelming. Going once, Higgins called out, his voice tinged with sorrow. Sterling smirked, tipping his hat to Clara. Going twice. Hold the hammer, old man. The voice was low, coated in gravel, and carried a quiet authority that instantly silenced the square. The crowd parted like the Red Sea. Walking down the dusty thoroughfare was a man no one had ever seen before. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and covered in the pale, chalky dust of the trail. He wore a long, canvas duster coat that swept the dirt, and a weathered Stetson pulled low over his eyes. But what drew everyone's attention was the low-slung gun belt resting on his hips, housing a custom-engraved Colt .45 with a staghorn grip. He didn't walk like a rancher. He walked with the dangerous, measured grace of a gunfighter. Sterling's hired men instinctively moved their hands toward their holsters. The stranger didn't even glance at them. He walked straight up to the courthouse steps, the silver spurs on his boots jingling a slow, rhythmic cadence. Auctions closed to latecomers. Stranger, Sterling snapped, his confident facade slipping for a fraction of a second. The cowboy ignored him entirely. He looked up at the clerk. What's the exact figure to clear the lien? Higgins blinked, adjusting his spectacles. $4,852.16, sir. But the bidding has already begun. The law states a debtor can settle the lien at any point before the gavel strikes wood. The stranger interrupted smoothly. He reached inside his heavy duster coat. Sterling's men tensed, drawing their weapons halfway, but the stranger wasn't pulling a gun. He pulled out a thick, leather-bound saddlebag pouch and tossed it onto the clerk's table. It hit the wood with a heavy, metallic thud that made Higgins jump. "Count it," the cowboy said. Higgins, with trembling hands, undid the leather straps. He gasped. Inside were stacks of crisp, United States gold certificates and a heavy canvas sack of minted gold eagles. The crowd erupted into furious whispers. No one carried that kind of liquid currency on them unless they had just robbed a train or struck a motherlode. "This is an outrage," Sterling shouted, his face flushing purple. He marched toward the steps. "Sheriff Miller, I demand you arrest this man. This money is undoubtedly stolen." Sheriff Miller stepped forward, placing a hand on his revolver. "Now, hold on. Josiah, I ain't arresting a man for paying a debt. Sir, I have to ask, what's your name, and where did you come by this kind of capital?" The stranger slowly pushed the brim of his hat up with his thumb, revealing piercing, steel-gray eyes and a jawline covered in dark stubble. "Name's Wyatt Donovan. The money is mine, won fair and square at a high-stakes faro table in Deadwood. Unless you've got a warrant with my name on it. Sheriff, that money clears the Broken Oak debt." Higgins frantically counted the stacks. "It's all here," he breathed, looking up in disbelief. "In fact, there's 5,000 here. It's over the amount. Keep the change for the filing fees," Wyatt said. "Sign the deed back over to the lady." Clara was entirely paralyzed. Her mind was spinning. She stepped forward, pushing past the murmuring townsfolk. "Mr. Donovan," she said, her voice shaking. I don't understand. I don't know you. I can't possibly accept this. If you are trying to buy the ranch from me." "I'm not buying your ranch, Miss Montgomery," Wyatt said, turning to look at her. The intensity in his eyes made her breath catch in her throat. "The deed is in your name, It stays in your name." "Then what do you want?" Clara demanded, her pride flaring up despite the miracle that had just occurred. "Are you looking for a percentage of the cattle, a stake in the railroad money? What is your price?" "I don't have a price," Wyatt replied softly, his voice dropping so only she could hear it. "Your father was a man of his word, Miss Montgomery. He believed in doing what was right, even when it cost him. Some debts aren't written on bank paper." Clara stared at him, bewildered. "My father. You knew Thomas?" Wyatt didn't answer. He turned to leave, walking right past a seething Josiah Sterling. But as Wyatt turned, a gust of hot wind blew the right side of his duster coat back. Clara gasped, taking a step forward. Hanging from Wyatt's vest pocket, glinting in the harsh Wyoming sun, was a heavy silver pocket watch secured by a braided leather chain. It wasn't just any watch. It was intricately engraved with the image of a broken oak tree. It was her father's watch, the exact watch the undertaker had sworn he had placed in Thomas Montgomery's casket before nailing it shut. Before Clara could utter a single word, Wyatt Donovan swung up onto a massive black gelding, tipped his hat to her, and rode out of the square, leaving a cloud of dust and a town full of unanswered questions in his wake. The dust from Wyatt Donovan's departure had long settled, but the storm in Clara Montgomery's mind was just beginning to rage. The image of the silver pocket watch, its braided leather chain, and the distinct fracture across the engraved oak tree burned behind her eyelids. It was impossible. She had stood in the dusty parlor of Elias Finch, the Cheyenne undertaker, and watched him place that very watch into her father's lifeless hands before sealing the pine casket. Clara did not sleep that night. By dawn, she had saddled her roan mare, strapping her father's Winchester repeating rifle to the saddle scabbard. She wasn't going to wait for the mystery to solve itself. Tracking a man like Wyatt Donovan through the harsh Wyoming backcountry was no task for a novice. But Clara had been raised tracking stray calves through blizzard conditions. Wyatt rode a heavy horse, and the fresh tracks of his black gelding led straight toward the jagged limestone cliffs of Dead Man's Wash. The sun was peaking at its zenith when she smelled the faint, metallic scent of brewing coffee. She dismounted, tying her mare to a scrub oak, and crept forward with the Winchester gripped tightly against her shoulder. Wyatt's camp was tucked into a narrow ravine. He sat by a small, smokeless fire, casually cleaning his Colt .45. He didn't look up, nor did he flinch, as Clara stepped out from behind a boulder, her rifle leveled squarely at his chest. "I'd advise against pulling that trigger." "Miss Montgomery," Wyatt said, his voice a low, calm gravel. He didn't even stop running the oiled cloth over his barrel. "The recoil on a Winchester .73 is liable to bruise a shoulder that ain't braced right. How did you get my father's watch?" "Mr. Donovan," Clara demanded, her voice betraying a slight tremor despite her fierce stance. "I saw him buried with it. If you're a grave robber as well as a gambler, I swear to God I will shoot you where you sit." Wyatt finally stopped his cleaning. He carefully set the cylinder back into his revolver, holstered it, and looked up at her. Those steel-grey eyes held a profound, unexpected sadness. "Your father wasn't buried with the watch, Clara," Wyatt said softly. He reached inside his heavy duster and pulled the silver timepiece free, tossing it onto the dirt halfway between them. "He mailed it to me. Sent it via the Wells Fargo Express line just 4 days before he supposedly fell off his horse." Clara lowered the rifle an inch, her brow furrowing in confusion. "That's a lie. He didn't know you. You said yourself, He owed a debt. He didn't owe me a debt, Wyatt corrected, standing up slowly so as not to spook her. I owed him. 5 years ago, down in Abilene. I was a young, reckless fool who got on the wrong side of a cattle baron's hired guns. They had me strung up in a barn, ready to stretch my neck. Thomas Montgomery was down there buying breeding stock. He walked into that barn with nothing but a shotgun and a stubborn streak, and he walked me out, saved my life, refused to take a dime for it. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. That sounded exactly like her father, proud, foolishly brave, and fiercely righteous. We kept in touch, Wyatt continued, reaching into his saddlebag. He pulled out a folded, yellowed piece of paper. He knew my line of work. I'm not a gambler. Clara, I'm a senior operative for the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, operating under a federal charter from Chicago. When things started going wrong at the Broken Oak, the poisoned water holes, the cut wire, the sudden foreclosure terms your father knew Josiah Sterling was behind it. But he couldn't prove it. Wyatt stepped forward, holding out the letter. Thomas wrote to me. He said Sterling was growing desperate for the railroad easement money, and he feared for his life. He mailed the watch as proof of his identity, telling me that if anything happened to him, I was to come to Cheyenne, find the watch, and know it was murder. Clara snatched the letter from his hand. She recognized the sharp, leaning cursive immediately. Her breath hitched as she read her father's final words. Wyatt, if this reaches you, Sterling has made his move. Protect Clara. The ranch is her future. Tears finally breached Clara's eyes, cutting hot tracks through the dust on her cheeks. He didn't fall, she whispered, her voice cracking. Sterling had him killed. A horse kick leaves a specific kind of trauma, Wyatt said grimly. When I got to town yesterday, I paid a visit to your undertaker, Elias Finch. A little persuasion, and Elias confessed. Your father's skull was crushed by a heavy iron blacksmith's hammer. Elias took $100 from Sterling to sign the death certificate as an accident and nail the coffin shut before you could look too closely. Clara fell to her knees in the dirt, the Winchester dropping beside her. The grief she had been holding back for months broke over her like a tidal wave, mixed with a white-hot, consuming rage. Her father had been murdered for a strip of dirt and iron rails. Wyatt knelt beside her. He didn't offer empty platitudes or patronizing pats on the back. He simply waited, a silent, solid presence in the storm of her grief. I brought the cash from Chicago, Wyatt explained quietly. $5,000 of Pinkerton operational funds. The agency wants Sterling. He's been running a land-grabbing syndicate across the Wyoming Territory, and the territorial governor, Thomas Moonlight himself, wants him in a federal penitentiary, but we needed him to show his hand. Clara wiped her face with the back of her sleeve, her eyes hardening into chips of flint. She looked at Wyatt, the grief transforming into a dangerous, calculated fury. He wanted to take my home at auction, she said coldly. Now that you've paid the debt, he has no legal way to take the land. Exactly, Wyatt nodded, which means Josiah Sterling is out of legal options. He knows the Union Pacific surveyors are returning next week to finalize the track route. Without that deed, he loses the biggest payoff of his life. So, what will he do? Wyatt's jaw tightened. Men like Sterling don't walk away. They burn the board down. He's going to come for the ranch, Clara, and he's going to come tonight. The moon over the Broken Oak Ranch remained hidden behind thick, bruised clouds, plunging the prairie into suffocating darkness. Inside the ranch house, the air grew heavy with the metallic tang of gun oil and nervous sweat. Clara Montgomery worked in grim silence, helping Wyatt barricade the heavy oak doors. Every time her hand brushed the rough timber of her home, she thought of her father's blood. "Keep your ammunition lined up," Wyatt instructed, peering through a narrow gap in the boarded window. "Sterling won't just send ordinary cowboys. He's a silent partner in the Cheyenne Club. Those wealthy cattle barons hire professional regulators, killers from Texas." Clara's blood ran cold at the mention of the Cheyenne Club, the real-life syndicate of ruthless power that controlled the territory's dark underbelly. "I've hunted coyotes in the pitch black since I was 12. "Wyatt," she said, sliding a heavy brass cartridge into her Winchester. "And these coyotes killed my father." Before Wyatt could reply, a rhythmic thudding vibrated through the floorboards. Hoofbeats. Heavy, fast, and entirely unbothered by stealth. Through the cracked boards, Clara saw them. 7 riders emerged from the tree line, carrying torches that threw dancing, demonic shadows across the dusty yard. In the center rode Josiah Sterling. Next to him was a scarred regulator named Cole, holding something far worse than a torch, a bundled wooden crate of Union Pacific dynamite. "He's not trying to shoot us out," Wyatt realized, his voice tightening with urgency. "He's going to blow the foundation to dust and blame it on an accidental fire. We cannot let them get close to the porch." "Burn the barn first," Sterling's voice echoed across the yard, sharp and commanding. "When the smoke flushes them out, shoot them down, leave nothing standing." "The hell you will," Clara whispered. She braced her Winchester against her shoulder, exhaled slowly, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle roared. Outside, the torch in Cole's hand exploded into a blinding shower of sparks, the wood splintering violently. He screamed, dropping the flame into the dust as his horse reared in panic. "Ambush!" Cole shouted, pulling his revolver. Gunfire erupted, tearing through the wooden siding of the house and shattering the remaining glass. Clara ducked instinctively as a heavy lead slug buried itself into the mantelpiece, showering her hair with plaster. Wyatt moved with terrifying, cold precision. Crack! A regulator fell backward from his saddle. Crack! Another man's horse bolted, dragging its terrified rider into the brush. "Sterling is mine!" Wyatt shouted over the deafening roar of the crossfire. "Keep them pinned off the porch!" Clara pumped the lever of her Winchester, firing rapidly at the blinding muzzle flashes in the dark. She hit a regulator in the shoulder, spinning him violently off his mount and into the dirt trough. Desperate. Cole grabbed a stick of dynamite from the crate, touching the short fuse to a smoldering piece of the dropped torch. Sizzling aggressively, he sprinted on foot toward the house. "Wyatt! The explosive!" Clara screamed. Wyatt kicked the front barricade aside with a massive thud. He threw the door open, stepping out onto the porch into the chaotic glow of the fire. His heavy duster billowed as he drew his Colt .45. He fanned the hammer. 2 shots rang out. Cole dropped instantly, the lit dynamite rolling from his lifeless fingers onto the dusty earth at the base of the stairs. Without a second of hesitation, Wyatt leapt off the porch, grabbed the sputtering explosive, and hurled it blindly toward the empty corral. The deafening blast shook the Wyoming earth, sending a massive geyser of dirt and splintered fencing into the night sky. The remaining regulators, terrified by the concussive explosion and facing the legendary, lethal speed of a Pinkerton agent, threw their hands up and dropped their weapons. Sterling, realizing his syndicate was entirely broken, yanked his horse's reins in a cowardly attempt to flee for the tree line. Bang! Sterling's expensive bowler hat flew off his head, a neat hole punched straight through the brim. He froze, yanking the horse to a halt. Clara stepped out onto the porch, her Winchester still raised, a thin trail of smoke curling from the barrel. "The next one," she called out, her voice ringing clear and authoritative across the yard. "Won't be a warning." Sterling slowly raised his trembling hands into the air. 2 weeks later, the Wyoming sun shone brightly over the patched porch of the Broken Oak. Governor Thomas Moonlight had personally overseen Sterling's transfer to the federal penitentiary in Laramie. The Union Pacific surveyors, desperate to distance themselves from the Cheyenne Club's explosive scandal, had agreed to Clara's incredibly steep price for the railway easement. The ranch was finally safe. Clara stood by the corral, watching Wyatt saddle his black gelding. He had swapped his trail coat for a clean shirt, but his heavy gun belt remained. "Chicago is a long way from Wyoming," Clara noted softly, stepping up to the fence. Wyatt paused, turning to face her. "It is. Too many people. Not enough sky." He reached into his pocket and held out her father's silver watch. "The debt is paid. Clara, you're free." Clara didn't take the watch. Instead, she reached out and closed her rough hands over his. "You paid the debt to my father, Wyatt, but I hold the deed to the wealthiest ranch in the territory now, and I find myself in desperate need of a partner." Wyatt looked down at their joined hands, then up at the vast, unbroken horizon. He finally smiled. "Well, I suppose the Pinkertons can find themselves another man, and that is the incredible story of Clara Montgomery and the mysterious cowboy who saved her legacy. What would you have done if a stranger handed you a fortune but carried a ghost from your past? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. If you loved this Wild West drama, hit that like button, share with your friends, and subscribe for more amazing real-life stories.